You are just a lowly maid. And look at you, standing here among people who built real lives. Do you even understand how embarrassing that is for this family? Margaret Collins did not bother lowering her voice. She did not care who heard. She shouted loudly in Nina's face. Nina froze as every eye in the room began to turn toward her. I am only doing my job, ma'am, Nina said. Well, Margaret said, her voice cutting smoothly through the music. Isn't this poetic? The women beside her turned to look. One of them asked politely, Margaret, who is she? Margaret's smile widened, amused. She? Margaret repeated, tilting her head slightly, as though the question itself were entertaining. She's complicated. Margaret took a small step closer, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She is my husband's daughter, Margaret explained with theatrical patience, though unfortunately, not mine. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether the remark was humor or insult. Margaret continued, lowering her voice only slightly, ensuring the nearest circle could still hear every word. You see, her mother was always fragile, Margaret said. Poor woman never truly recovered after giving birth. A soft murmur rippled through the small group. Margaret looked directly at Nina now. And ever since then, she added lightly, this girl has brought nothing but misfortune wherever she goes. Nina kept her eyes lowered, focusing on balancing the tray in her hands. Mrs. Collins, one guest said cautiously, perhaps tonight is not the time. Oh, nonsense, Margaret interrupted with a small laugh. We are among friends. She turned toward Nina again. Tell me, Nina, she said sweetly, have you finally accepted what you are? Nina's fingers tightened around the tray. I am working, she answered softly. Margaret smiled. Yes, she said. You are. Her eyes moved slowly over Nina's uniform, exactly where you belong. A few nearby guests exchanged uneasy glances. One man cleared his throat, attempting to redirect the conversation toward business matters, but Margaret was not finished. You know, she continued, swirling the wine gently in her glass. Sometimes life makes decisions for us. Some people are born to lead. Others are born to serve. Her gaze hardened slightly. And some, she added, are simply born unlucky. The music continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. Nina felt heat rising behind her eyes. She tried to step away quietly, but Margaret took another step forward. Your poor mother, Margaret said softly, almost thoughtfully. If she had not given birth to such a burden, perhaps she would still be alive today. The words struck harder than the noise of the crowded room. Nina looked up before she could stop herself. My mother did not die because of me, she said quietly, her voice trembling but clear. Margaret's eyebrows lifted. Oh, she replied. Then why did everything in that woman's life fall apart the moment you arrived? Nina swallowed. She was sick, Nina said. Long before I was born. Margaret's smile faded. You should not correct me, she said coldly. I am not correcting you, Nina answered, barely breathing. I am asking you not to blame me for something I did not cause. Several nearby conversations had grown quiet. The tension began drawing attention. Margaret's expression hardened. So now the maid argues, she said. I am not just a maid, Nina replied softly, the words escaping before fear could silence them. I am not just a maid, Nina replied softly, the words escaping before fear could silence them. The sound of the slap echoed sharply against the crystal-lined walls. Gasps broke through the nearby crowd. Margaret's hand struck Nina's cheek with sudden force, causing her balance to falter. The tray slipped from her hands. Nina fell hard to her knees. Margaret looked down at her calmly. You forget yourself, she said. Thomas Brooks appeared beside Margaret, his expression tense but restrained. That is enough, he said, though his tone lacked urgency. Margaret adjusted the bracelet on her wrist. She raised her voice to me, Margaret replied. Thomas glanced at Nina on the floor, embarrassment crossing his face. Nina, he said sharply, stand up and remove yourself from this area. You are drawing attention. Nina's cheek burned as she struggled to her feet. I didn't mean to interrupt the evening, she said quietly. Then don't, Thomas replied firmly. Go somewhere else, now. As Nina stepped backward, trying to escape the circle of watching eyes, She collided gently into someone behind her. Strong hands steadied her shoulders before she could lose balance again. Alexander Wolf's gaze swept across Nina's face for a moment, then paused at the faint red mark on her cheek. Then his eyes shifted slowly toward Margaret. "What happened here?" Alexander asked calmly. Margaret forced a polite smile. "A minor misunderstanding," she replied smoothly. Alexander did not return the smile. His voice remained steady. "I do not tolerate misunderstandings that leave my staff on the floor." Margaret hesitated for the first time that evening. "She spoke out of place," Margaret replied. Alexander's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "And that justifies striking her?" The surrounding guests fell silent. Thomas stepped forward slightly. "It was a family matter," he said quickly. Alexander looked directly at him. "This is my event," Alexander replied quietly. "There are no private matters in my house when someone is treated without respect." He turned to Nina. "Are you injured?" he asked. "No, sir," Nina answered immediately. Her voice was barely steady. Alexander nodded once, then looked toward security near the entrance. "Escort this lady out," he said calmly. Margaret's composure fractured. "I beg your pardon?" she said sharply. "You are no longer welcome at this gathering," Alexander continued, his tone unchanged. "This is unacceptable," Margaret said, her voice tightening. Alexander's gaze remained steady. "No," he replied. "What was unacceptable has already occurred." Two security personnel stepped forward politely but firmly. Margaret looked toward Thomas, expecting support. Thomas hesitated. Margaret's control slipped visibly as she realized the room had already chosen its side. Alexander extended his hand toward Nina, helping her stand upright. "No one under my roof has ever spoken to that way," he said quietly. The sound of the orchestra returned slowly, cautiously, as though even the musicians needed a moment to recover from what had just unfolded. Conversations resumed in careful tones, quieter than before, measured, observant. In rooms filled with influence, people knew when something significant had happened, even if no one spoke about it directly. Nina remained still for a brief moment after Alexander Wolf released her hand. Her cheek still burned faintly, but the deeper sensation came from something unfamiliar being seen not as an inconvenience, but as someone worth defending. She lowered her eyes instinctively, unsure where to stand or what to do next. Years of conditioning told her to disappear quickly, to minimize disruption, to remove herself before becoming the center of further attention. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Alexander's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "You have nothing to apologize for," he replied. The words were simple, yet they landed with surprising weight. Few people had ever said that to her. Around them, guests pretended not to stare, though Nina could feel the curiosity lingering in the air. Some returned to discussions about investment portfolios and medical research grants, but their voices carried subtle distraction. A quiet incident had occurred, and quiet incidents in rooms of power were rarely forgotten. Thomas Brooks avoided Nina's gaze entirely. He muttered something brief to one of the guests near him, attempting to restore normal conversation. His discomfort was visible in the stiffness of his shoulders. Margaret, now absent, had taken with her the illusion that this evening would proceed exactly as planned. Alexander turned slightly toward one of the attendants. "Have someone clean this," he said calmly, nodding toward the shattered glass still scattered across the marble floor. The instruction was carried out immediately. Efficiency returned. Control returned. But the atmosphere had changed. Alexander studied Nina for a moment longer, noticing the subtle tremor in her hands as she adjusted the sleeve of her uniform. "What is your name?" he asked. "Nina," she answered. "Nina," he repeated, as though ensuring he would remember. His tone contained no judgment, no curiosity disguised as politeness. Simply acknowledgement. "You may take a moment," he said quietly. "There is no urgency here." Nina hesitated. She had never been told to take a moment. Moments were usually privileges reserved for people whose presence mattered. "Thank you, sir," she said. She stepped toward a quieter section of the ballroom, near a tall window overlooking the illuminated gardens. Outside, soft lights traced the pathways between trimmed hedges and stone statues, that had likely been imported from somewhere in Europe decades earlier. Her reflection in the glass revealed a faint redness still visible on her cheek. She touched it lightly, then quickly lowered her hand. The room behind her continued its steady rhythm of restrained conversations and polite laughter. Crystal glasses touched softly. Shoes moved gently across polished marble. Eleanor, the senior house manager, approached quietly from Nina's left side. "You handled that with dignity," Eleanor said in a low voice. Nina offered a small nod. "I caused disruption," Nina replied. Eleanor's lips curved slightly. "Disruption is sometimes another word for truth arriving at the wrong time," she said. Nina was unsure how to respond. She had spent most of her life trying to avoid truth when truth created discomfort. "You are safe here," Eleanor added gently before returning to coordinate service arrangements. Safe. The word felt unfamiliar. Across the ballroom, Alexander spoke briefly with several guests whose attention carried the weight of influence. He did not appear agitated, yet the stillness around him suggested authority that did not need display. Several guests nodded respectfully as he spoke. Others watched with quiet curiosity. A man known for managing investment portfolios leaned toward a colleague and murmured something Nina could not hear, though she recognized the tone of people recalculating social dynamics. Power often rearranged conversations. One of the younger servers approached Nina with a fresh tray. "You can switch with me for a while," he offered kindly. Nina shook her head gently. "I am all right," she said. He nodded respectfully and moved on. Minutes passed. The music softened into a slower melody. Alexander eventually approached again, his presence noticeable not because he demanded attention, but because attention naturally moved toward him. "Walk with me," he said quietly. Nina hesitated only briefly before following. He guided her toward a smaller adjoining room used for more private conversations. The lighting there was softer, the atmosphere quieter, the conversations more thoughtful. A small table held untouched glasses of sparkling water. Alexander gestured toward a chair. "You may sit," he said. Nina sat carefully, uncertain whether comfort was permitted. Alexander remained standing for a moment, then sat across from her. His gaze was steady but not invasive. "What happened earlier," he said calmly, "will not happen again under my invitation." Nina nodded slightly. "It was a family matter," she replied automatically. Alexander's expression remained composed. "Respect is not a family matter," he said. "It is a human one. If this moment touched something inside you, share where you are watching from and tell us what respect means in your life. Your voice matters, and your story might inspire someone who needs courage today. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join a community that believes dignity should never be ignored." The statement lingered in the air between them. Nina had no immediate answer. Years of habit encouraged her to minimize, to excuse, to reduce conflict. "I am used to managing such situations," she said quietly. Alexander considered this. "No one should become accustomed to being treated without dignity," he replied. His tone was not sympathetic. It was factual. That difference mattered. Nina folded her hands gently in her lap. Her voice was calm, though softer now. "I appreciate your intervention," she said. Alexander inclined his head slightly. "I do not intervene unnecessarily," he answered. He paused briefly. "But when I do, it is because something requires correction." Correction. The word felt strangely reassuring. It suggested order, balance, fairness. Alexander observed her posture for a moment. "You work diligently," he said. "Eleanor speaks highly of you." Nina lowered her eyes modestly. "I try to be useful," she answered. Alexander's gaze sharpened slightly. "Usefulness is not the same as worth," he said. The distinction settled quietly inside her thoughts. Few people had ever separated the two. Outside the room, the faint sound of conversation continued, punctuated by soft laughter and the gentle clink of glassware. Alexander stood. "You may return when you are ready," he said. Nina rose as well. "Thank you," she said again. As she walked back into the ballroom, she noticed the atmosphere had stabilized. Conversations flowed again, though with slightly more awareness than before. Respect, once introduced into a room, rarely left unnoticed. Nina resumed her duties, her movements steady, her posture unchanged. Yet something internal had shifted. For years, she had believed survival required silence. Tonight suggested another possibility, not loud defiance, not confrontation, but the quiet realization that dignity did not need permission to exist. As the evening continued, Nina moved gracefully through the room, offering refreshments, adjusting settings, ensuring guests experienced seamless hospitality. Several guests nodded politely when she passed. One elderly woman offered a small, kind smile. Recognition did not need to be spoken, it only needed to be felt. Near midnight, as the final conversations began to slow and guests prepared to depart, Nina stood briefly beside the tall windows once more. Outside, the gardens remained illuminated, unchanged. Inside, something had altered permanently. She did not yet know how deeply, but she understood one truth with new clarity. Respect, once witnessed, becomes difficult to forget. The final guests departed with the careful politeness that defined people accustomed to maintaining influence. Handshakes lingered just long enough to signal respect but not enough to reveal intention. Car doors closed softly along the circular driveway, engines fading into the quiet Connecticut night. The orchestra had long since packed away their instruments, leaving only the faint echo of earlier melodies resting in the high ceilings of the estate. Inside, the staff moved with calm efficiency, collecting empty glasses and restoring the ballroom to its pristine order. Evidence of the evening's tension disappeared piece by piece, as though the house itself preferred discretion. Nina carried a tray of unused champagne flutes toward the service corridor, her steps steady but slower than usual. Fatigue had settled into her muscles, yet her thoughts refused to quiet. The events of the evening replayed with unsettling clarity. Margaret's voice, the sharp crack of the slap, the cold marble beneath her palms, and then the firm steadiness of a stranger's hand lifting her back to her feet. She had experienced humiliation before, but never interruption, never protection. In the service hallway, Eleanor supervised quietly, her presence composed, her attention attentive to every small detail that ensured the evening ended as seamlessly as it had begun. "You may leave the tray there," Eleanor said gently. Nina placed the glasses carefully onto the polished counter. "Thank you," she replied. Eleanor studied her for a brief moment. "Some nights change the direction of a life," Eleanor said calmly. Nina hesitated. "I do not know if tonight changed anything," she answered. Eleanor's expression softened slightly. "Change rarely announces itself immediately," she said. Nina considered the words but did not respond. She had learned not to expect transformation simply because something painful had been witnessed. Beyond the service corridor, the grand staircase curved upward beneath warm golden light. The house had returned to silence, the kind of silence that wealthy homes often carried after guests departed quiet but never empty. As Nina prepared to collect the final linens from a smaller reception room, she noticed Alexander Wolfe standing near the study entrance, speaking quietly with a man in a tailored charcoal suit. Their conversation appeared brief but deliberate. When the other man nodded and departed, Alexander remained still for a moment, as though considering something unresolved. He noticed Nina approaching. "You are still working," he observed. "There are tasks remaining," she answered. "There are always tasks remaining," he replied. Nina lowered her eyes slightly, unsure whether the statement carried instruction. Alexander opened the study door. "Come in for a moment," he said. The study felt different from the rest of the house. Dark wood shelves lined the walls, filled with books bound in deep leather tones. A soft amber lamp illuminated a polished desk arranged with deliberate simplicity. The faint scent of cedar and aged paper created an atmosphere of quiet authority. Alexander gestured toward a chair. "You have been standing for many hours," he said. Nina sat carefully, uncertain whether rest was appropriate. Alexander remained standing briefly near the window, observing the darkened gardens beyond the glass. The exterior lights illuminated stone pathways that appeared unchanged, undisturbed by the evening's events. "You handled an unpleasant situation with restraint," he said finally. "I did not intend to create difficulty," Nina replied. Alexander turned slightly. "You did not create it," he said. The distinction lingered. Nina folded her hands gently in her lap. Silence in the room felt calm rather than tense. Alexander studied her expression carefully. "You have worked here for 3 weeks," he said. "Your references described reliability. Discipline, discretion. Nina nodded. I try to fulfill expectations, she said. Alexander's gaze remained steady. And what expectations do you hold for yourself? He asked. The question felt unfamiliar. Few people had ever asked what she expected from life beyond obedience. I expect to remain employed, she answered honestly. Alexander considered the response. Employment is a circumstance, he said, not an identity. Nina absorbed the statement quietly. Identity was a concept she rarely allowed herself to consider. Her role had always been defined by others. Family expectations, social limitations, unspoken hierarchies. You were not surprised by her words tonight, Alexander observed. No, Nina admitted. That suggests repetition, he said. She hesitated. Some people prefer familiar judgments, she said softly. They believe repetition makes them true. Alexander inclined his head slightly. Repetition only makes something comfortable, he said. Not correct. The quiet conviction in his tone felt steady, not dramatic. Nina had encountered anger before, but calm certainty felt more powerful. Does your family often attend gatherings of this nature? Alexander asked. Occasionally, she replied carefully. And they are comfortable speaking to you that way in public? Nina lowered her gaze. Comfort grows when behavior is never challenged, she said. Alexander nodded slowly. That changes tonight, he said simply. The certainty in his voice did not feel impulsive. It felt considered. Nina's hands tightened slightly in her lap. I do not wish to create conflict, she said. Alexander's expression did not shift. Conflict already exists, he replied. Ignoring it does not remove it. The clock on the far wall marked the passing minutes with quiet precision. Nina realized she had not felt rushed since entering the room. No one demanded immediate efficiency. No one criticized her posture. No one corrected her breathing. You may continue your work if you wish, Alexander said. I do wish to complete my responsibilities, she answered. He nodded once. Responsibility is admirable, he said, but so is perspective. Nina rose carefully. Thank you for your time, she said. Alexander's gaze softened slightly, though his composure remained unchanged. You are not required to thank me, he replied. Respect is not charity. The words remained with her as she returned to the service corridor. The remaining tasks felt lighter, though not easier. Sheets folded, candles extinguished, glass polished, order restored. Near 1 a.m, the final lights dimmed gradually across the estate. Eleanor approached Nina near the staff entrance. You may rest now, she said kindly. Nina nodded. Good night, she replied. Outside, the air carried the crisp coolness of late autumn. The sky stretched clear and dark above the quiet neighborhood, distant city lights faintly visible along the horizon. Nina paused briefly on the stone steps before walking toward the small guest quarters located behind the main house. For the first time in many years, her thoughts did not revolve around apology. Instead, they returned repeatedly to one unexpected realization. Someone had intervened, and that difference altered something fundamental. Inside her room, Nina removed the simple uniform jacket and placed it neatly over the chair. Her reflection in the mirror revealed faint redness still visible along her cheek. She touched the mark gently. Pain faded. Memory remained. She sat on the edge of the bed, her posture still straight from habit. Margaret's words echoed faintly in her mind. You are just a lowly maid. But another voice had entered the space once occupied only by judgment. No one under my roof is ever spoken to that way. Nina lay back slowly, staring at the ceiling illuminated by soft lamplight. For years, she had believed dignity was something granted by family approval. Tonight suggested otherwise. Dignity could exist independently, waiting for recognition. As sleep gradually claimed her thoughts, one idea remained steady. Respect, once experienced, becomes a standard, and standards, once raised, rarely lower themselves again. The following morning arrived with a quiet stillness that felt unfamiliar to Nina. The estate, which only hours before had been filled with the low murmur of wealth and influence, now rested in composed silence. Sunlight filtered gently through tall windows, illuminating polished wooden floors and long corridors that seemed to hold secrets within their walls. Nina woke earlier than necessary, as she always did. Habit had trained her body to rise before expectation could find her unprepared. The faint mark on her cheek had faded overnight, leaving only the memory of the moment behind. Yet the memory itself felt different now. It no longer carried only humiliation. It carried interruption, something she had never experienced before. She dressed carefully in the staff uniform, smoothing the fabric instinctively as she studied her reflection. The woman in the mirror appeared unchanged, but something in her eyes had shifted. Not confidence, not yet, but awareness. Downstairs, the kitchen had already come to life. Eleanor stood near the long central counter reviewing the day's schedule, her reading glasses balanced delicately on the bridge of her nose. "Good morning, Nina," Eleanor said warmly. "Good morning," Nina replied. Eleanor studied her briefly. "You rested?" she asked. "Yes," Nina answered, though her thoughts had been active long after midnight. Eleanor nodded approvingly and handed Nina a neatly printed list. "Mr. Wolf has meetings throughout the morning, a small working lunch at noon, 3 guests at 4, dinner will be private." Nina reviewed the paper carefully. Everything was structured, precise, predictable. The opposite of the emotional unpredictability she had grown accustomed to in her father's house. By mid-morning, the estate had resumed its steady rhythm. Phones rang quietly in the administrative office. Staff moved calmly through hallways carrying documents, flowers, fresh linens. A delivery of imported fruit arrived at the service entrance, carefully inspected before being arranged in the kitchen. Nina found comfort in routine. Routine did not humiliate. Routine did not accuse. Routine allowed her to breathe. At 11:30, Alexander Wolf entered the kitchen, his presence announced not by noise but by subtle awareness among the staff. Conversations softened. Movements grew slightly more precise. He wore a charcoal suit, his posture relaxed but attentive. "Good morning," he said simply. "Good morning, sir," Eleanor replied. Nina nodded respectfully. Alexander paused briefly near the counter where Nina was arranging plates. "You appear well today," he said. The comment surprised her. "Yes, sir," she answered. He studied her expression for a moment. "Good," he said, then continued toward the study. The interaction lasted only seconds, yet it lingered in Nina's thoughts longer than she expected. At noon, the working lunch began in the smaller dining room. 2 men in their 50s discussed manufacturing contracts while reviewing printed proposals. Their conversation remained professional, occasionally punctuated by dry humor that suggested long experience navigating complex negotiations. Nina served quietly, attentive but unobtrusive. One of the men nodded politely when she refilled his glass. "Thank you," he said sincerely. The simple courtesy felt surprisingly meaningful. After the guests departed, the afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Eleanor approached Nina near the kitchen doorway. "Mr. Wolf would like to speak with you again," she said calmly. Nina's pulse quickened slightly, though she did not show it. She walked toward the study with measured steps. Alexander stood near the large window overlooking the gardens, reviewing documents held neatly in one hand. "You requested me, sir?" Nina asked respectfully. "Yes," he said, setting the papers aside. He gestured toward a chair, though he remained standing. "I prefer clarity," he said. "Yesterday presented circumstances that should be addressed directly." Nina folded her hands lightly. "I regret any discomfort caused," she replied. "You continue to apologize for events beyond your control," he observed. She lowered her gaze. "Apologies prevent escalation," she answered. Alexander considered this. "Sometimes," he said, "but sometimes they encourage repetition." The statement carried quiet truth. "I have made inquiries," Alexander continued. Nina looked up slightly, uncertain. "Your previous employer provided a strong reference," he said. "You left that position voluntarily despite financial difficulty." Nina hesitated. "The environment was not suitable," she said carefully. Alexander nodded. "And your education?" "I completed 2 years of community college," she answered. "Why did you not continue?" "Financial constraints," she replied simply. Alexander observed her posture, her tone, her restraint. "You demonstrate discipline," he said. "That quality is not limited to domestic work." Nina felt uncertainty stir. "I am grateful for employment," she answered. "Gratitude is not a limitation," Alexander said. He walked slowly around the desk. "You do not see your own potential clearly," he added. The words felt unfamiliar. Few people had ever suggested potential. Most had suggested limitation. "I perform the duties assigned," Nina replied. Alexander stopped near the bookshelf. "You perform them exceptionally," he said. He removed a small notebook from the shelf and placed it gently on the desk. "This house operates multiple business interests," he explained. "Logistics, property management, investment coordination." Nina listened carefully. "Positions exist that require organization, discretion, and reliability," he continued. "Skills you already demonstrate." She remained still. "Opportunity often carried risk." "And why would you consider me for such responsibility?" she asked quietly. Alexander's expression remained composed. "Because I value efficiency," he said, "and I do not ignore evidence of capability." He paused briefly. "People reveal their character most clearly when under pressure." Nina understood the reference. "Yesterday," he continued, "you maintained composure despite provocation." She lowered her eyes again. "I have experience maintaining composure," she said. Alexander nodded slightly. "Yes," he replied, "that is precisely why improvement becomes possible." The clock ticked softly on the far wall. Nina considered his words carefully. "I do not wish to presume beyond my role," she said. Alexander's tone remained steady. "Growth is not presumption," he replied. The distinction felt significant. "I would require training," she admitted. "That can be arranged," he said. Silence settled briefly. Not uncomfortable. Measured. Nina realized this was the first conversation about her future that did not involve limitation. Only possibility. "You may consider the matter," Alexander said finally. "I appreciate the consideration," she replied sincerely. He inclined his head slightly. "You may return to your duties," he said. As Nina stepped back into the hallway, the world felt subtly altered. Nothing dramatic had occurred. No promises had been forced. No expectations demanded. Yet something had shifted internally. For years, survival had meant minimizing expectation. Now expectation itself seemed to be changing shape. Late afternoon sunlight filled the corridor with soft amber light as Nina resumed her responsibilities. Tasks remained the same. Polish glass, arrange documents, prepare evening tea, but intention had begun to evolve. As she aligned a stack of files on the office desk, she noticed her hands no longer trembled as they once had. Confidence had not yet arrived, but doubt had begun to loosen its grip. Some changes begin quietly, without announcement, without permission, only with the simple realization that one's story may not yet be finished. The following days unfolded with quiet precision, yet something beneath the surface had undeniably changed. Nina still woke before sunrise, still moved through the corridors with careful steps, still ensured every detail of the Wolf estate reflected discipline and order. But now, each small action carried a new awareness, the awareness that someone had noticed her not merely as labor, but as a person capable of more. By the end of the week, autumn had settled firmly over Connecticut. The gardens behind the estate glowed in muted shades of amber and deep crimson, leaves falling in slow spirals across the stone paths. The air carried the crisp clarity that often encouraged reflection, the kind that reminded older generations of how quickly time moved and how quietly opportunities appeared. Inside the estate, preparations were underway for another gathering, smaller than the previous event but still attended by individuals whose decisions influenced companies, legal systems, and philanthropic institutions. Eleanor reviewed logistics with calm authority while Nina assisted with the preparation of the reception room, carefully arranging leather folders and crystal water glasses along the polished conference table. "You are adapting quickly," Eleanor observed. "I am learning," Nina replied. Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Learning is often the difference between surviving and building," she said. Nina considered the distinction carefully. For most of her life, survival had been sufficient. Now, the idea of building something, even something small, felt both unfamiliar and quietly hopeful. Late in the afternoon, Alexander Wolf entered the conference room while reviewing notes on a tablet. He paused briefly as he observed Nina adjusting the placement of a series of documents. "You maintain consistency," he said. Nina stepped back respectfully. "I prefer order," she answered. Alexander glanced at the table. "Order creates clarity," he replied. The meeting that followed included 4 individuals representing legal counsel, investment planning, and property development. Their conversation remained measured but purposeful, touching upon zoning considerations, regulatory compliance, and long-term expansion strategies. Nina served tea and water silently, attentive without drawing attention. At one point, one of the older guests, a silver-haired banker named Mr. Halpern, thanked her directly. "You anticipate well," he said politely. "Thank you," Nina replied. Alexander observed the brief exchange but did not comment. After the guests departed, the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the conference table, highlighting the careful alignment of every document. Alexander remained seated, reviewing a final page before setting the tablet aside. "Nina," he said. She turned slightly. "Yes, sir. You understand written organization?" "I do," she answered. "I assisted with clerical work in a previous position." He nodded. "Come here a moment." She approached the table. Alexander gestured toward several folders. "These contracts require indexing by priority and confidentiality level," he explained. "Observe the categories." Nina studied the documents carefully. Her eyes moved methodically across headings, dates, and signatures. Within moments, she recognized patterns. "These 3 relate to long-term property agreements," she said. "This one appears time-sensitive." Alexander watched her quietly. "And these," she continued, "require legal review before execution." He inclined his head slightly. "Correct." He did not offer praise easily, but approval did not always require words. "Organization is a form of leadership," he said. "People rely on clarity when decisions carry consequence." Nina absorbed the statement thoughtfully. She had never associated her attention to detail with leadership. For years, she had been told such qualities were simply expected from someone in her position. "Would you feel comfortable assisting with administrative coordination when necessary?" Alexander asked. The question arrived calmly, without pressure. "Yes," she replied carefully, "if I am properly instructed." Instruction had always been her gateway to competence. Alexander gathered the folders and placed them into a leather portfolio. "Training begins with observation," he said. That evening, Nina remained in the office longer than usual, reviewing organizational systems. Eleanor explained patiently. Filing structures, scheduling logic, document classification, each task required precision, but precision felt natural to her. Numbers aligned. Timelines made sense. Responsibilities followed sequence. There was reassurance in structure. Later, while preparing tea in the kitchen, Nina noticed Marcus, one of Alexander's senior security advisors, reviewing a tablet near the counter. Marcus had a calm presence, his voice measured, his demeanor respectful. "You learn quickly," Marcus remarked. "I try not to make errors," Nina answered. Marcus gave a slight smile. "Everyone makes errors," he said. "Some simply learn faster from them." Nina poured hot water into a porcelain cup. Steam rose gently, catching the soft kitchen light. "You were composed the other night," Marcus added. Nina hesitated. "I was embarrassed," she admitted. Marcus nodded. "Embarrassment fades," he said. "Character remains." The comment stayed with her long after he left the room. That night, Nina reviewed the small notebook Eleanor had given her earlier in the day. Inside were simple notes on professional conduct, scheduling terminology, and communication protocols used in corporate environments. She read slowly, absorbing each line. For years, she had believed intelligence required permission. Now she began to understand learning required only effort. Outside, the wind moved softly through the trees, carrying fallen leaves across the stone walkway. Change often sounded quiet. The following morning, Alexander reviewed several documents while Nina organized correspondence nearby. He observed her briefly. "You ask few questions," he noted. I prefer to understand before I speak, she replied. Alexander nodded once. An effective quality, he said. He paused before adding, confidence does not require noise. The statement felt steady, reassuring. By midweek, Nina assisted with scheduling coordination under Eleanor's supervision, calendar adjustments, reminder notices, secure document labeling responsibilities expanded gradually, deliberately. Each successful task reinforced something previously unfamiliar. On Thursday afternoon, a handwritten note arrived addressed to Alexander Wolf. The envelope bore the formal crest of a well-known philanthropic foundation. Alexander reviewed its contents briefly. Nina, he said. She approached respectfully. This invitation concerns a charity board requiring logistical preparation, he explained. He handed her the document. Review and prepare preliminary scheduling options. Nina accepted the paper carefully. Yes, sir. The responsibility felt significant. Later that evening, as she arranged files in the quiet office, she noticed something unexpected. Her hands were steady. She realized something subtle, yet profound. Respect had begun to influence how she viewed herself. As she turned off the desk lamp and prepared to leave for the night, one thought remained clear. Sometimes dignity is not restored in dramatic moments. Sometimes it returns gradually, one responsibility at a time. And sometimes, the smallest opportunity becomes the first brick in the foundation of an entirely new life. By Friday afternoon, the rhythm of the Wolf estate had begun to feel less foreign to Nina. The pace remained disciplined, the expectations precise, yet the atmosphere no longer carried the quiet tension she had grown accustomed to in her father's home. Here, correction was direct, but never humiliating. Silence was not used as punishment. Work was evaluated by outcome, not by status. The charity board event mentioned earlier in the week had grown into a significant responsibility. The foundation hosting the gathering supported educational grants for students from disadvantaged communities, a cause that resonated deeply with many of the older business leaders expected to attend. Eleanor explained that such events were less about public recognition and more about long-term influence. Relationships formed in those rooms often shaped decisions years later. Nina sat at the large administrative desk reviewing scheduling options for the upcoming meeting. Her pen moved steadily across the notepad as she cross-referenced travel times, dietary preferences, and accessibility requirements for guests whose reputations had been built over decades of careful work. Many of them were now in their late 50s or 60s, individuals who valued reliability above novelty. Consistency earns trust, Eleanor had told her earlier that morning, and trust is the most valuable currency in any room. Nina understood that instinctively. Trust had always been something she tried to earn, though rarely something she expected to receive in return. Marcus entered briefly, placing a folder beside the desk. These are confirmed security arrangements, he said. Nothing complicated, but preparation avoids unnecessary surprises. Nina nodded. Thank you. Marcus paused, observing the notes she had organized. You structure information clearly, he remarked. I try to make things easier for those who depend on them, she replied. Marcus gave a slight approving nod before leaving. Late afternoon light filtered through tall office windows, illuminating dust particles drifting slowly through the air. The calm environment allowed Nina to think without urgency. She noticed that she was no longer second-guessing every small decision. The instructions were clear, the expectations reasonable, and mistakes were treated as correctable, rather than punishable. Alexander entered the office shortly before 4, reviewing messages on his phone. You have prepared options? He asked. Yes, Nina replied, handing him the organized schedule. Alexander scanned the document carefully. You accounted for travel delay variables, he observed. Yes, she said. Several guests are traveling from outside the state. He nodded once. Appropriate foresight. The approval was subtle, but meaningful. Have you encountered logistical planning before? He asked. Only in small contexts, she replied honestly. Alexander closed the folder. Scale changes complexity, he said, but principles remain consistent. He paused before adding, attention to detail prevents unnecessary correction later. Nina appreciated the clarity of that statement. Later that evening, The estate prepared for a smaller private dinner. Unlike previous gatherings, this one felt quieter, more reflective. The guest list included a retired federal judge, a medical researcher, and a foundation director in her early 60s known for her advocacy and community education initiatives. Their conversations carried depth rather than performance. Topics ranged from long-term economic responsibility to ethical leadership. Nina served tea as the judge spoke thoughtfully about the importance of measured decision-making. Reputation, he said calmly, is not built by dramatic actions. It is built by consistent ones. The researcher nodded in agreement. Integrity often appears quiet, she added. The conversation felt different from the shallow social performances Nina had witnessed growing up. These individuals spoke less about appearance and more about responsibility. As she poured tea, the foundation director thanked her directly. "You are very attentive," the woman said kindly. Nina inclined her head. "I aim to be precise," she replied. Precision had always been her protection. After dinner concluded, Nina assisted Eleanor in organizing follow-up documentation requested by the guests. Several letters of introduction needed to be drafted for scholarship candidates, along with structured timelines for upcoming committee reviews. "You read quickly," Eleanor observed as Nina reviewed a draft. "I prefer understanding expectations clearly," Nina answered. Eleanor smiled faintly. "Clarity reduces anxiety," she said. That statement felt deeply familiar. For years, anxiety had been Nina's constant companion. Uncertainty created vulnerability, clarity created stability. Later, while filing correspondence, Nina overheard part of a conversation between Alexander and the retired judge near the study entrance. "You trust your instincts with people," the judge remarked. "I trust patterns," Alexander replied. "And what pattern did you see here?" the judge asked. "Discipline without entitlement," Alexander said calmly. The judge nodded thoughtfully. "That combination is rare," he replied. Nina did not know whether she was meant to hear those words, but they remained with her as she continued organizing documents. For the first time in many years, she felt her presence acknowledged without criticism. That night, as she reviewed the next day's preparation list, Eleanor handed her a slim binder containing operational guidelines for internal coordination. "This will help you understand procedural expectations," Eleanor said. Nina accepted it carefully. "Thank you. You earn responsibility by demonstrating readiness," Eleanor added. The statement felt encouraging rather than intimidating. Later, alone in her room, Nina opened the binder and began reading slowly. Terminology related to scheduling hierarchy, confidentiality protocols, and communication structure filled the pages. Some sections felt unfamiliar, but she did not feel overwhelmed. She felt curious. Curiosity had once felt dangerous. Now it felt necessary. Outside, wind moved softly through the trees, carrying dry leaves across the stone walkway behind the estate. The sound reminded her of autumn evenings from childhood, when her mother would open windows despite the chill simply to let fresh air circulate. "Growth requires movement," her mother used to say. Nina had not understood those words at the time. Now she began to. Before turning off the light, she paused briefly, reflecting on the week that had passed. Only days earlier, she had believed her future would be limited to quiet survival. Now, subtle possibilities had begun to appear. Not as promises, but as openings. Respect had not transformed her circumstances instantly, but it had changed how she viewed herself within them. She no longer felt entirely invisible. As she placed the binder carefully beside her bed, one thought settled gently into place. Some people spend years waiting for permission to become who they already are. Sometimes, all it takes is one person refusing to accept the version of you that others insisted was permanent. And once that possibility appears, even quietly, it becomes difficult to return to believing you were meant to remain small forever. The invitation arrived on a quiet Monday morning, printed on thick ivory paper embossed with the seal of the Hamilton Education Foundation. Nina noticed the envelope resting neatly on the polished desk in the administrative office, placed among several other documents requiring Alexander Wolf's review. The Foundation's events were known for attracting influential leaders whose reputations had been built over decades of steady work rather than fleeting visibility. For many of them, charitable contributions were not about public praise but about legacy. Alexander entered the office shortly after 9, removing his gloves with the calm efficiency that seemed natural to him. His presence carried the same composed stillness Nina had come to recognize as a signal of focus, rather than tension. He glanced briefly at the envelope before opening it with measured precision. "They have confirmed the date," he said, reviewing the contents quickly. "Attendance will be significant." Nina stood nearby, prepared to note any instructions. "This event will include several individuals whose influence extends beyond business," Alexander continued. "Judicial members, foundation trustees, and policy advisors." Nina nodded, writing carefully in the scheduling ledger. "Would you prefer preliminary coordination with the foundation's administrative office?" she asked. Alexander looked at her briefly. "Yes," he said. "Demonstrate clarity and restraint in communication." Restraint. The word remained consistent in his expectations. Throughout the morning, Nina coordinated quietly with Eleanor to finalize the logistics. Seating considerations required particular attention, as certain individuals preferred distance from political rivals, while others valued proximity to long-standing allies. Nina discovered that such details, though seemingly small, often determined the tone of entire conversations. By early afternoon, Eleanor reviewed Nina's proposed arrangement. "You anticipate sensitivities well," Eleanor observed. "I try to understand what is not openly stated," Nina replied. Eleanor smiled slightly. "That skill often prevents unnecessary tension." Later that day, Marcus entered the office carrying a tablet displaying updated security confirmations. "The guest list includes individuals with public visibility," he explained calmly. "Nothing concerning, but discretion remains essential." Nina reviewed the names carefully. Several were familiar from news publications she occasionally read in the staff lounge, judges known for landmark rulings. A retired ambassador recognized for decades of diplomatic service. A foundation chairwoman who had dedicated 30 years to expanding educational access for disadvantaged communities. People who had built influence slowly, carefully, consistently. As preparations continued, Nina noticed a pattern emerging within her own thinking. She no longer evaluated herself solely in terms of avoiding mistakes. She had begun anticipating outcomes, considering consequences, understanding how small actions could influence broader results. Confidence had not yet fully formed, but competence had begun to replace fear. 2 days before the event, Alexander requested a brief review meeting in the study. The room remained quiet, lined with shelves of legal volumes and historical biographies reflecting a respect for precedent and measured decision-making. "You have structured the event flow logically," he said, examining the finalized plan. "I attempted to maintain simplicity," Nina replied. "Simplicity often requires greater effort than complexity," he observed. He set the document aside. "You adapt efficiently," he continued. "Have you considered long-term professional development?" The question felt significant. "I have not allowed myself to consider it extensively," Nina answered honestly. Alexander regarded her thoughtfully. "Limitation imposed by others often becomes internalized," he said. "Recognition is the first step toward removing it." Nina absorbed the words slowly. She had lived many years believing her circumstances defined her possibilities. Now, possibility itself felt uncertain, but not impossible. On the evening of the foundation event, the estate carried a quieter atmosphere than previous gatherings. Conversations centered on policy, education reform, and the importance of mentorship for future generations. The guests, many in their late 50s or 60s, spoke with the reflective tone of individuals aware that legacy mattered more than recognition. Nina moved through the room with calm assurance, ensuring documents were available where needed and refreshments served with quiet attentiveness. Her movements no longer carried the hesitation of someone afraid to be noticed. Instead, she demonstrated the quiet confidence of someone focused on purpose rather than perception. During a pause between discussions, the foundation chairwoman approached her. "You manage logistics professionally," the woman said kindly. "Thank you," Nina replied. "Have you worked in organizational administration before?" the chairwoman asked. "I am learning," Nina answered. The woman nodded approvingly. "Learning with discipline leads to mastery," she said. Later in the evening, as guests departed gradually, Alexander spoke briefly with the retired ambassador near the study entrance. "You choose your staff carefully," the ambassador remarked. I choose individuals who demonstrate consistency, Alexander replied. Consistency often reveals character, the ambassador said thoughtfully. Alexander inclined his head slightly. Nina overheard only fragments, but the meaning felt clear. Her work was being evaluated beyond surface level. After the final guest left, Eleanor reviewed the evening's execution with quiet satisfaction. No disruptions, she said. Nina nodded. Preparation reduced uncertainty, she replied. Eleanor placed a folder on the desk. These documents will require follow-up correspondence tomorrow. Nina accepted them confidently. Later that night, as she walked slowly through the quiet corridor toward her room, Nina realized how significantly her internal dialogue had changed in only a short time. She no longer replayed Margaret's words repeatedly. Their power had weakened, replaced gradually by evidence of capability she could not deny. She had completed complex coordination. She had communicated with professionals who valued clarity. She had contributed to outcomes that required trust. Trust. The concept felt unfamiliar, yet increasingly present. Inside her room, she opened the window slightly, allowing cool night air to enter. The sound of distant leaves brushing against stone created a quiet rhythm that felt grounding. For years, her sense of identity had been shaped by exclusion. Now it began to form through participation, not dramatic transformation, not sudden reinvention, but gradual restoration of something that had always existed beneath imposed limitation. She sat at the small desk and reviewed the next day's schedule, noting adjustments calmly. Her handwriting appeared steady, deliberate, confident in its precision. She realized something subtle, yet profound. Her future was no longer defined solely by survival. It was beginning to include direction, and direction, once discovered, rarely disappears. As she turned off the light, one quiet understanding remained. Respect does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it appears in responsibility, sometimes in expectation, and sometimes in the simple realization that your presence is no longer being tolerated, it is being valued. The following week introduced a quiet turning point that Nina did not immediately recognize as significant. Responsibility had gradually replaced hesitation in her daily routine, and the Wolf estate no longer felt like unfamiliar territory. The polished corridors, once intimidating in their silence, now reflected the steady rhythm of work she had learned to navigate with precision. She no longer walked as though expecting correction with every step. Instead, she moved with measured intention, focused on outcomes rather than avoidance. On Wednesday afternoon, Alexander Wolf requested her presence in the study once again. The request was delivered simply, without urgency, yet Nina sensed that the conversation would extend beyond routine coordination. The study remained unchanged, shelves of carefully selected books, documents arranged with deliberate simplicity, warm amber light casting calm shadows across dark wood surfaces. The room carried an atmosphere that encouraged clarity of thought. Alexander stood near the desk, reviewing several financial summaries. When Nina entered, he gestured toward the chair across from him. You have adapted efficiently, he said without preamble. I have been fortunate to receive clear instruction, Nina replied. Instruction explains process, he said. Discipline explains results. Nina listened carefully. You have demonstrated both, he continued. She remained still, unsure whether acknowledgement required response. Alexander closed the folder before him. Have you considered what direction you would choose if limitation were removed from the decision? He asked. The question felt unfamiliar. For years, Nina had not allowed herself to imagine direction. Direction implied permission. Permission had rarely been offered. I am still learning what options exist, she answered honestly. Alexander nodded slightly. That is a reasonable beginning, he said. He moved toward the window, briefly observing the quiet gardens beyond the glass. People often underestimate how deeply external judgment shapes internal expectation, he continued. When someone is told repeatedly that their role is small, they eventually stop examining larger possibilities. Nina understood the truth of that statement intimately. I believed stability required silence, she admitted quietly. Stability requires structure, Alexander replied. Silence is often mistaken for structure. The distinction settled deeply within her thoughts. Alexander returned to the desk and opened a thin folder containing enrollment information for several professional certification programs. These courses provide foundational knowledge in administrative coordination, project logistics, and financial documentation management, he explained. Each offers evening instruction compatible with your current responsibilities. Nina studied the material carefully. The language felt formal but accessible. Tuition figures were listed clearly, schedules outlined realistically. These opportunities would expand your professional capacity, he said calmly. Nina hesitated. I would need to ensure I could meet expectations, she replied. Expectation encourages preparation, Alexander said. He paused briefly before adding, capability develops through use. Nina considered the possibility quietly. She had not enrolled in formal study since leaving community college years earlier, when financial pressure had forced her to choose immediate survival over long-term development. I do not wish to assume resources beyond my position, she said carefully. Alexander regarded her thoughtfully. You are not requesting charity, he said. You are evaluating investment. The wording reframed the idea completely. Investment implied return. Return implied value. Any advancement you achieve remains yours, he continued. Skills cannot be withdrawn once acquired. Nina lowered her eyes thoughtfully. For years, she had accepted limitation as permanence. Now, permanence itself seemed uncertain. I will review the programs carefully, she said. That is sufficient, Alexander replied. The conversation concluded without pressure. Choice remained hers. Later that afternoon, Nina discussed the material with Eleanor in the administrative office. Education rarely follows a straight timeline, Eleanor said kindly. Many professionals return to study after decades. I worry I may not adapt quickly enough, Nina admitted. Eleanor smiled gently. Adaptation depends on willingness, not age, she said. That evening, Nina reviewed the course outlines slowly, making notes in the margins of the printed pages. Project coordination principles, financial record management, professional communication frameworks. The subjects felt practical rather than abstract. She recognized elements already present in her daily responsibilities. The unfamiliar became gradually approachable. Marcus noticed the open materials when he passed through the office. Professional training? He asked calmly. I am considering it, Nina replied. Marcus nodded. Preparation rarely harms opportunity, he said. His words carried the quiet confidence of someone who valued competence above display. Later that night, Nina sat by the small desk in her room, reading through enrollment requirements again. The soft lamplight illuminated the pages, while cool autumn air moved gently through the slightly open window. The distant sound of wind brushing against tree branches created a steady rhythm that helped her concentrate. She realized something important. Fear of inadequacy had prevented many decisions in her past. Now, she examined the possibility that inadequacy often diminishes through effort, rather than avoidance. She completed the preliminary application form slowly, ensuring accuracy in every detail. Each line represented more than information. Each line represented acknowledgement of her own existence beyond imposed limitation. Before sealing the envelope, she paused briefly. Margaret's voice echoed faintly in memory. You are just a lowly maid. But the sentence no longer defined her direction. It had become simply something someone had said, not something permanently true. The following morning, Nina placed the completed application envelope on Alexander's desk as instructed. He reviewed it briefly. You considered carefully, he observed. Yes, she replied. Thoughtful decisions often produce durable results, he said. He placed the envelope among outgoing correspondence. This will be submitted today. Nina inclined her head slightly. Thank you. He regarded her calmly. You are not required to thank me for supporting rational progress, he said. She understood. Respect functioned differently here. Respect expected growth. Over the following days, Nina continued her responsibilities with increasing confidence. She noticed her posture had changed subtly. She no longer anticipated criticism before beginning a task. She focused instead on execution. Clarity reduced hesitation. Structure reduced doubt. One afternoon, while reviewing scheduling adjustments, She realized she had completed multiple advanced coordination tasks without seeking reassurance. Capability had begun replacing uncertainty. Without announcement, that evening, as she organized documents in the softly lit office, she reflected on the unexpected direction her life had taken in such a short period of time. Only weeks earlier, her identity had been defined by dismissal. Now her future included development. Not guaranteed success, but genuine opportunity. Opportunity felt unfamiliar, yet she did not retreat from it, because something fundamental had changed. She no longer viewed herself solely through the lens of past judgment. She had begun seeing evidence of her own competence. And evidence, once recognized, becomes difficult to ignore. As she turned off the office light and prepared to rest, one quiet realization remained steady. Sometimes the greatest shift in a life is not dramatic transformation. It is the simple decision to no longer accept a definition created by someone else. 1 year later, the late autumn air returned to Connecticut with the same quiet dignity Nina had come to appreciate. The trees surrounding the Wolf estate once again wore shades of amber and deep crimson, their leaves falling slowly across the stone walkways in patterns that felt familiar, almost reassuring. Time had moved forward with its usual indifference. Yet the life Nina now inhabited bore little resemblance to the uncertainty she had known only months earlier. The office overlooking the gardens had become her primary workspace, a place where organization and responsibility shaped each day. The desk no longer felt intimidating. The neatly aligned documents, the structured calendar entries, the quiet rhythm of communication with partners and institutions had become part of her professional identity. She no longer hesitated before speaking during coordination meetings, nor did she apologize unnecessarily when offering informed recommendations. Competence had matured into quiet confidence. That morning, a courier delivered several envelopes requiring signature authorization. Among them was a letter bearing the official seal of the certification board whose program Nina had completed only weeks earlier. She paused briefly before opening it, her hands steady but aware of the significance contained inside the envelope. The letter confirmed her successful completion of Advanced Administrative Coordination Certification, awarded with distinction for consistent performance and exceptional analytical discipline. The wording was formal, measured, yet unmistakably affirming. For a long moment, Nina simply read the letter again, allowing the meaning to settle fully. Achievement felt different when earned quietly. No applause, no announcement, only evidence. She placed the letter carefully inside the top drawer of her desk. Not hidden, but protected. Alexander entered the office shortly afterward, reviewing morning correspondence. "You received confirmation," he observed. "Yes," Nina replied. He nodded once. "Results reflect preparation," he said. The simplicity of his acknowledgement carried genuine respect. "I appreciate the opportunity you made possible," she said. Alexander regarded her calmly. "Opportunity was available," he replied. "You chose to use it. The distinction mattered. Ownership of effort remained hers." Later that afternoon, Eleanor joined them briefly to review operational adjustments for several upcoming events. Nina contributed recommendations regarding scheduling efficiency that reduced unnecessary delays between meetings. Eleanor reviewed the revisions with visible approval. "You anticipate process flow naturally now," Eleanor said. "I have learned to consider consequences earlier," Nina answered. Eleanor smiled. Experience refines instinct. After the meeting concluded, Nina returned to her desk to prepare correspondence for the Hamilton Foundation. The chairwoman had requested logistical consultation for a regional scholarship expansion initiative. The request represented a level of professional trust Nina once would not have imagined receiving. Her pen moved steadily across the page as she structured a clear, concise response, outlining timeline coordination options and documentation procedures. Her writing reflected clarity, precision, confidence developed through consistent practice rather than assumption. Late in the afternoon, Marcus entered with updated security confirmations for an upcoming board meeting. "You have become difficult to replace," he remarked calmly. "I aim to remain reliable," Nina replied. Marcus inclined his head slightly. "Reliability builds reputation," he said. Reputation. The word carried new meaning now. Reputation no longer referred only to family name or inherited status. It referred to demonstrated consistency. Later that evening, Nina attended a small professional reception hosted by the foundation. The gathering took place in a historic building overlooking the river, its architecture reflecting decades of careful preservation. Many attendees belonged to the generation that valued patience, loyalty, and steady contribution over rapid recognition. Several individuals she had previously corresponded with greeted her politely. "Miss Brooks," the foundation chairwoman said warmly, extending her hand. "Your recommendations proved exceptionally useful. I am pleased they met expectations," Nina replied. "They exceeded them," the chairwoman said. "Clarity is increasingly rare." The conversation remained professional but genuine. No one questioned her presence. No one suggested limitation. Participation had replaced justification. As the evening progressed, Nina listened thoughtfully as several senior members discussed the importance of mentorship for younger professionals navigating uncertain beginnings. One gentleman in his 70s summarized the sentiment quietly. "Opportunity matters," he said, "but guidance matters more." Nina understood the truth of that statement deeply. Guidance had altered her direction entirely. When she returned to the Wolf estate later that evening, the familiar quiet of the gardens greeted her once more. Soft pathway lights illuminated the stone walkway as leaves drifted gently across the ground. Inside, Alexander reviewed correspondence near the study window. "The reception was productive?" he asked. "Yes," Nina replied. "The foundation will proceed with the regional expansion plan." He nodded. "Appropriate." He paused briefly before adding, "Your progress reflects sustained discipline." Nina inclined her head respectfully. "I have learned that discipline creates options," she said. Alexander regarded her thoughtfully. "Options create independence," he replied. Independence. The word carried weight. For years, independence had seemed distant, reserved for people whose lives began with advantage. Now she understood independence could also be constructed, piece by piece, decision by decision. Later that night, Nina sat at her desk reviewing upcoming schedules, her handwriting calm and steady. She noticed the absence of hesitation that once accompanied even minor responsibilities. She no longer viewed herself through Margaret's dismissive voice. That voice had lost authority, not erased, but diminished. Experience had replaced assumption. Evidence had replaced accusation. Her identity no longer relied on permission from those unwilling to offer respect. It relied on demonstrated value. As she prepared to rest, she paused briefly beside the window, observing the quiet gardens illuminated by soft golden light. The world outside remained unchanged, but her place within it had transformed. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but undeniably. She no longer waited for acceptance from those determined to withhold it. She had built something stronger, self-respect reinforced by action, opportunity strengthened by effort, direction clarified by discipline. Margaret's words had once defined her limitations. Now they existed only as a distant echo, a reminder of how easily potential can be misjudged, and how powerfully it can re-emerge when given space to develop. Before turning off the light, Nina wrote her name clearly at the bottom of the final document prepared for the following day. Nina Brooks. The signature appeared steady, complete, undiminished. For the first time in many years, her name no longer felt like something she needed to defend. It felt like something she had earned. And that quiet realization marked the beginning of a life no longer defined by survival alone, but guided by dignity, purpose, and the understanding that respect, once established within oneself, can never again be permanently taken away. This story reminds us that dignity does not come from wealth, family status, or the opinions of those who try to diminish our worth. True value is revealed through perseverance, integrity, and the courage to keep moving forward, even when treated unfairly. Nina's journey shows that silent strength is never weakness, and that justice often arrives not through revenge, but through growth, discipline, and self-respect. The story teaches that the people who try to define us do not have the final word. Our choices, our effort, and our refusal to remain small ultimately shape the life we deserve. Respect begins the moment we stop believing we are unworthy of it. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.